In the quiet, palm-lined streets of Coconut Grove, Miami, the night of October 3rd was supposed to be ordinary, but as midnight approached, a fire erupted that would shake the neighborhood and the nation to its core. Inside that burning home was 67-year-old Cassie Phillips, a retired schoolteacher who had spent her life nurturing others. Outside, standing in the flickering glow of the flames, was her grandson, 16-year-old Leo Phillips, watching, motionless. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, a beloved grandmother lost to a house fire. But behind the smoke and ashes lay something far darker, a calculated act of betrayal that investigators would soon uncover piece by piece. A security camera, a red gas can, a notebook filled with disturbing calculations, and a teenager whose calmness would haunt detectives for years. This is not just a story about murder. It's about trust turned to terror, love twisted into control, and the haunting question: what drives a child to destroy the very person who saved them? If you're drawn to real stories that test the limits of human darkness, where truth is more chilling than fiction, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dive documentaries. And if this case already has you hooked, share it with someone who loves true crime mysteries as much as you do. Now, let's step into the fire. The night of October 3rd began like so many others in Miami's Coconut Grove, humid, still, and deceptively calm. The kind of night where ceiling fans hum lazily above polished floors, and the air smells faintly of sea salt drifting in from Biscayne Bay. On Cassie Phillips's street, the palm trees barely moved. Porch lights glowed in neat suburban rows. Most of her neighbors had already gone to bed, lulled by the rhythmic chorus of cicadas and the faint whine of passing traffic on US 1. Yet somewhere inside that peaceful quiet, a plan was already in motion, a plan that would end in screams, flames, and questions that Miami would spend years trying to answer. Shortly after midnight, the first tendrils of smoke curled from the eaves of Cassie's modest two-story home. At first glance, it might have looked like an electrical short, a spark in an old wire, maybe, or a candle left burning. But within seconds, the smoke thickened, rolling out into the night air in waves so black and dense they swallowed the moonlight. Inside, somewhere beyond the choking haze, Cassie Phillips was still alive. The 70-year-old retired schoolteacher had gone to bed early, the way she always did, after making tea and double-checking that her grandson's bedroom light was off. She had no reason to suspect that just beyond her window, someone she loved, was moving through the shadows with a red gasoline can in hand. The first 911 call came at 12:17 a.m. A neighbor's panicked voice crackled through the dispatcher's headset. "There's a fire! It's the Phillips house! She's still inside!" By the time firefighters arrived 4 minutes later, the entire structure was engulfed. Flames clawed up the white siding and burst through the roof, sending a column of fire spiraling into the humid sky. The heat was so intense it blistered paint on the house next door. Captain Lorenzo Diaz, a 23-year veteran of the Miami-Dade Fire Department, would later tell reporters he had never seen a blaze spread so fast or so precisely. "It was as if the fire knew where it wanted to go," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "This wasn't random combustion. This was designed." While his team battled the inferno, something else caught Diaz's attention. A lone figure sitting on the curb across the street, illuminated by the strobing red-blue lights of the fire trucks. A teenage boy, barefoot, in a gray hoodie. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shouting. He was just watching. Later, the captain would remember that detail more vividly than any other. The boy's stillness against the chaos, his eyes reflecting the fire like dark mirrors. Detective Marcus Wilson arrived just after dawn, when the fire was finally out and the air smelled of wet ash and gasoline. Wilson had seen hundreds of fires in his career, some accidental, many not. But something about this scene unsettled him immediately. The burn patterns were too clean, too deliberate. There were multiple points of origin, and every one of them centered around the bedroom where Cassie had slept. In his report, he would later write, "This was not a house fire. This was an execution disguised as tragedy." As crime scene technicians picked through the wreckage, the sun rose over Miami's skyline, painting the horizon in coral and gold, a beautiful, indifferent contrast to the horror on the ground. Reporters had already gathered beyond the yellow tape, microphones in hand, describing the event as an unthinkable loss. At that moment, they still believed the teenager sitting silently nearby was another victim, a boy who had lost everything. None of them knew that Leo Phillips wasn't just the witness to this nightmare, he was its author. Cassie's body was found near the bedroom window, as if she'd tried to escape. The glass had shattered inward from the heat, but the window frame itself was sealed in black carbon, a telltale sign of accelerant poured from the outside. The medical examiner's team worked quietly, carefully lifting the remains onto a stretcher. Even the most seasoned officers turned away. Captain Diaz, normally stoic, muttered a prayer under his breath. When he looked back across the street, Leo Phillips hadn't moved. He simply asked an officer, "So, where am I supposed to stay now?" That single question set off alarms in Wilson's mind. There was no tremor in Leo's voice, no grief, no confusion, just the detached curiosity of someone inconvenienced by logistics. It was the first crack in the narrative of an accidental fire. Over the next several hours, investigators combed through the debris. What they found confirmed every uneasy instinct Wilson had felt. The strongest burn patterns radiated outward from Cassie's bedroom, and chemical tests on the charred floorboards detected traces of gasoline. Melted residue matching the composition of a common red plastic gas can was recovered near the back porch. And on the front lawn, a faint set of shoe prints leading away from the house toward the curb where Leo had been sitting. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came not from the crime scene, but from Cassie herself. Hidden inside a fireproof box in the closet, investigators found a small journal, its edges singed but the handwriting inside perfectly legible. The final entry, dated 3 weeks before her death, read, "I'm scared of what Leo's becoming. I keep hoping the boy I raised is still in there somewhere, but lately, when I look at him, I don't recognize what's staring back." Those words would later haunt Detective Wilson, because they weren't the words of a woman oblivious to danger. They were the words of someone who knew exactly what was coming and couldn't stop it. When news of Cassie's death broke, tributes flooded social media. Former students called her the kindest teacher they ever had. Parents wrote about her after-school tutoring and her habit of buying supplies out of her own paycheck. "She made every kid feel like they mattered," one former pupil posted. The public image was of a woman who embodied patience, generosity, and faith in second chances, qualities that made the story of her death almost impossible to comprehend. As the day wore on, Leo was brought to the police station for a routine interview. Detective Wilson watched him through the one-way mirror, the way he sat upright, hands folded neatly, answering questions with the calm precision of a boy taking a school exam. He claimed he had been at a friend's house all evening and came home to find the fire already raging. When asked why he hadn't called 911, Leo shrugged. "Someone else was already doing that," he said. Something about his tone, the absence of fear, the perfect composure, reminded Wilson of every sociopath he'd ever interviewed. But he kept his poker face, filing the observation away. At 16, Leo Phillips still had the benefit of the doubt. For now. Meanwhile, forensic technicians traced the accelerant pattern again and again, mapping it like a blueprint. Each line of flame seemed to have been placed deliberately around exits, doors, windows, forming what the experts called a fire trap. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted the house to burn. They wanted Cassie to have no way out. The realization hit the entire team with the same grim weight. This was homicide. Outside the police station, cameras flashed as reporters hunted for details. "Grandson questioned in fatal fire," one headline read. Neighbors watched the coverage in disbelief. Some refused to believe Leo could be involved. Others whispered that Cassie had seemed worried lately, locking her doors more often, skipping her evening walks. A few recalled hearing shouting from the house in recent weeks, a deep, angry male voice cutting through the quiet. Back inside, Detective Wilson's gut told him that the answer to what happened wasn't in the ashes of the home. It was sitting in the interrogation room across the hall. Still, without solid proof, there was little he could do. Leo was released that evening into temporary state custody while the investigation continued. As he walked out of the precinct, past the swarm of reporters, he didn't flinch at the shouted questions. He simply looked up at the night sky, expressionless, as if nothing at all had changed. But everything had. Over the next 24 hours, lab results began to return. Gasoline residue matched the same grade sold at a Shell station less than a mile from Cassie's house. And when Wilson requested the station's security footage, he froze the tape at 11:07 p.m. There, in grainy black and white, stood Leo Phillips, sliding a red plastic gas can across the counter and handing over cash. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't hiding. He even used his student ID card to get a discount. It was the moment the tragedy became a crime. For Wilson, the rest of the night was a blur of evidence logs and phone calls. The pieces were beginning to align. A fire that spread too efficiently, a suspect too calm, a gas purchase too close to the time of ignition. Yet beneath the paperwork, the detective couldn't shake the human part of the story. A grandmother who had spent her life teaching children empathy had died at the hands of the one child she refused to give up on. When the sun rose again over Coconut Grove, the house at 1428 Banyan Drive was nothing but a skeleton, black beams jutting upward like charred bones against the pastel morning. Neighbors placed flowers at the curb. Someone hung a handmade sign that read, "We love you, Mrs. Phillips." The air still carried the faint, bitter tang of smoke, the smell of a home erased. Detective Wilson stood there one last time before leaving the scene, notebook in hand, eyes on the spot where Cassie's bedroom had been. He tried to imagine her final moments, the confusion, the terror, the realization that the fire wasn't random. And then he pictured Leo, sitting calmly across the street, illuminated by the inferno. The image lingered like an afterimage burned into the mind's eye, the kind of picture that never fades. That was the night everything changed. For a neighborhood that lost its sense of safety, for a detective whose instincts would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of his career, and for a 16-year-old boy whose calmness in the face of horror would soon reveal something far more terrifying than anyone dared to believe. Because this wasn't just a fire. It was the beginning of a revelation that sometimes the most monstrous acts start with the smallest spark. When first responders arrived that night, the world was painted in orange and red, sirens echoing through the narrow Coconut Grove streets, firefighters shouting through thick black smoke, the rhythmic whoosh of pressurized hoses fighting a blaze that refused to surrender. Amid all that motion, one image stood disturbingly still. A teenage boy sitting cross-legged on the curb across from the fire, his face illuminated by the violent glow of destruction. That boy was Leo Phillips. And in the years to come, that moment, that eerie calm, would be studied, replayed, and dissected by investigators, psychologists, and anyone trying to understand how a child could sit so serenely while watching his own grandmother burn alive. To the firefighters who saw him that night, Leo seemed oddly detached, almost robotic. When Officer Alicia Fernandez approached him, her instinct told her something was off. He didn't smell of smoke or sweat, no signs he'd been inside trying to help. His clothes were clean, his breathing steady. When she asked if anyone was inside the house, He answered flatly, "My grandmother sleeps with her door locked." Then, as flames reached the second floor and the structure began to collapse, he tilted his head slightly, watching as though it were a scene unfolding on television. Not horror, not grief, just observation. In her report later, Fernandez described Leo's demeanor as unusually calm, verging on indifferent. It wasn't the first time she'd seen shock. She'd seen husbands babble incoherently, mothers collapse screaming. But she'd never seen composure like that. She offered him a blanket, but he refused. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low, almost polite. There was no trembling, no visible tears, just that steady, unwavering stare. What no one on the street knew was that Leo's calm wasn't shock. It was calculation. Inside, he was watching to see how well his plan was working, whether the fire spread as he intended, whether anyone had noticed him earlier, whether his alibi would hold. Every second of silence was, to him, control. Control over chaos, over narrative, over consequence. It was the very thing he felt he'd been denied his entire life, and in that moment, watching flames consume the woman who had raised him, he finally believed he had it. Detective Marcus Wilson would later say that when he first laid eyes on Leo, the word that came to mind wasn't killer. It was vacuum. There was something missing behind his eyes, Wilson recalled in an interview years later. He wasn't processing the fire like a normal person would. He wasn't grieving or confused or even frightened. He was just watching, like he'd come to see how something he built was working. That instinct, quiet but certain, would drive the rest of Wilson's investigation. The next morning, the boy was taken in for questioning. Not as a suspect yet, but as a witness. Sitting across from the detective in a sterile room that smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee, Leo looked smaller than he had at the crime scene. His hoodie was gone, replaced by a wrinkled t-shirt with a faded science logo across the chest. His hair was damp from a shower at the youth center, yet his eyes remained unchanged, unblinking, analytical. When Wilson asked if he was ready to begin, Leo nodded. "Sure," he said, as if it were an appointment he'd been expecting. For the first hour, their conversation was unremarkable. Wilson asked about the night of the fire, when Leo last saw his grandmother, where he'd been, what time he got home. Leo's answers came smooth and immediate. He said he'd spent the evening at his friend Jason Miller's house, playing video games. He'd left around midnight, noticed the glow of the fire from down the street, and ran toward it, too late to do anything. His tone was calm, his recollection precise. He even managed to sound appropriately regretful. "I should have called 911, he said, "but I just froze." It might have worked, too, if not for the details. Wilson had spent decades listening to liars. The good ones lied with conviction. The great ones lied with consistency. Leo, though, slipped in small ways. His timeline shifted by minutes here and there. He mentioned things he couldn't have seen unless he'd been closer to the fire. And when asked what he remembered most about that night, he said something Wilson would never forget. "It was quiet, like she'd already stopped screaming by the time I got there." That line landed like a weight in the room. Wilson leaned forward slightly, pen hovering over his notebook. "You said you were still down the street when you saw the fire, right?" he asked. Leo blinked. "Yeah." "Then how would you know when she stopped screaming?" The pause that followed was almost imperceptible, a beat too long before Leo shrugged. "I guess. Maybe I didn't hear anything. That's what I meant." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. For Wilson, that was the first real confirmation of what his gut had been telling him. Something about this boy didn't fit the role of victim. His detachment wasn't just emotional shutdown, it was deliberate. And as he looked across the table, Wilson began to wonder what could have created that kind of coldness in someone so young. To understand that, you had to look beyond the fire, back into the quiet, private world of Cassie Phillips and her grandson. Neighbors would later describe Cassie as the kind of woman who believed she could fix anything with patience and love. She had been a teacher for 42 years, the kind who brought snacks for kids who forgot lunch and spent her weekends making lesson plans by hand. When her daughter Lisa spiraled into addiction, Cassie didn't hesitate to step in and take custody of her grandson. Leo was 11 at the time, small, quiet, with a stubborn streak that his teachers chalked up to adjustment issues. Cassie saw potential. She believed, as she always had, that no child was beyond saving. But behind closed doors, things weren't so simple. The boy she took in had already seen too much. The shouting, the eviction notices, the night spent in a car while his mother nodded off in the front seat. Trauma had shaped him before Cassie could reach him. She enrolled him in therapy, joined parent support groups, and filled the house with structure. Dinner at 6, homework by 7, lights out by 10. She kept photos of his childhood taped to the fridge, reminders of better days. She thought routine would make him feel safe. Instead, to Leo, it felt like confinement. Over time, the warmth in their home began to cool. Cassie's neighbors noticed the tension, the slammed doors, the shouting that echoed late into the night. Once, a delivery driver heard Leo yell, "You're not my mother," and the sharp crack of something breaking. Cassie always smoothed it over with polite smiles. "Teenage years," she'd say. "We're working through it." But her journal told a different story. In the weeks before her death, Cassie's handwriting grew shaky. She wrote about money missing from her purse, dead animals found in her garden, drawings she'd discovered in Leo's room, violent sketches of fire and destruction. "I'm trying to believe this is just imagination," she wrote. "But sometimes, when I catch him watching me, it feels like there's nothing behind his eyes, nothing human." The tragedy of Cassie Phillips is that she never stopped believing she could reach the good in him, even when fear had already taken root. Her love became a shield she refused to lower, even as cracks appeared in the glass. And Leo, he learned how to hide behind that belief. He knew how to mimic what people expected to see: remorse, gratitude, affection. He understood that the right smile could buy him another chance, another ounce of trust. But behind that mask, something else was growing: an idea, a way out. After the fire, those closest to Cassie described her as increasingly anxious in the final weeks of her life. She had installed a small security camera in her bedroom, disguised as a digital alarm clock, something she told a neighbor was for peace of mind. No one realized how prophetic that decision would be. That footage would later become the most haunting evidence of all. But for now, in the days following the blaze, all anyone saw was a tragedy. News outlets painted Leo as a quiet, heartbroken teen who'd lost his only family. Donations poured in for his recovery. Strangers called him the boy who survived. Even Detective Wilson, hardened as he was, felt a flicker of pity as he watched the coverage, until he noticed something others didn't. Every time cameras turned toward Leo, his face changed. The blank detachment would shift into practiced grief, a hand wiping at dry eyes, a tremble in his voice. And then, as soon as the cameras looked away, the mask dropped. Empty again. That small detail, that performance, was what pushed Wilson deeper into the case. He began pulling surveillance footage from nearby homes, looking for anything unusual before the fire. What he found was exactly that. A camera 2 doors down had captured a figure moving around Cassie's property just before midnight, pouring something along the foundation walls. The movements were slow, deliberate. The figure paused at the bedroom window, bent down for several seconds, then disappeared into the darkness. The timestamp read 11:34 p.m. The 911 call came at 12:17. When Wilson froze the frame, zoomed in, and lightened the image, he saw a shape he recognized: the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head. It wasn't proof yet, not legally. But to him, it was confirmation. The boy on the curb had been there long before the fire started. In the following days, the investigation shifted. What had begun as an arson inquiry quietly evolved into a homicide case. Search warrants were filed. Leo's electronics were seized. And beneath the calm exterior of that polite teenager, cracks began to show. When detectives questioned him again about his timeline, his answers started to drift. His story about Jason Miller's house didn't match Jason's parents' recollections. His explanation for buying gasoline for a friend's dirt bike made no sense. And then, when confronted with the footage of him at the gas station, Leo made his first real mistake. He smirked. "That could be anyone," he said. It was the first time Wilson saw something raw slip through the boy's mask. Not fear, but arrogance. That smirk told him everything. By now, psychologists would later say Leo had developed what they call instrumental detachment, the ability to view other people, even family, as tools in his own story. To him, Cassie wasn't a person. She was an obstacle. Her love had turned into a cage. Her concern had become surveillance, and in his mind, the only way to reclaim control was to eliminate her entirely. As investigators pieced together Leo's movements that night, the picture sharpened into something chillingly precise. He left Jason's house at 10:30, walked to the gas station, bought fuel at 11:07, returned to his grandmother's neighborhood at 11:30. Then, for nearly 30 minutes, he prepared the scene, pouring accelerant, blocking exits, ensuring no chance of escape. He waited across the street, watching until the flames took hold. Then he sat, as he had planned, on the curb. The perfect witness, the innocent survivor. The psychology of that moment fascinated experts who later studied the case. How could a 16-year-old plan something so coldly, so patiently? The answer, they argued, lay not in age, but in empathy. Or rather, the absence of it. Leo understood emotions the way an actor studies a script. He knew when to cry, when to pause, when to appear vulnerable. But he didn't feel any of it. To him, emotion was manipulation. By the end of that first week, the boy on the curb was no longer a witness. He was a suspect. And when the evidence began to close in, the gasoline residue, the surveillance, the inconsistencies, Detective Wilson knew it was time to bring him back in. Only this time, it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be an interrogation. But even then, even as the walls began to close around him, Leo didn't panic. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. In every photo, every frame of video, he remained eerily composed, a teenager surrounded by flames of his own making, still believing he could control the outcome. The boy on the curb hadn't just watched his grandmother's house burn. He had watched the world bend to his story, at least for a little while. Before the fire, before the headlines, before Leo Phillips became a name whispered with disbelief and fear, there was Cassie Phillips, a woman whose life was defined not by tragedy, but by kindness. In every story told about her, one detail always surfaces. She believed with unshakable conviction that people could be saved. Her neighbors, her former students, even the grocery clerks who helped her load bags into the trunk, they all used the same words when describing her. She had that light, that warmth, the kind of patience that made even the most restless child stop and listen. But perhaps what no one realized, not until it was far too late, was that Cassie's greatest strength was also her greatest vulnerability. She couldn't stop loving people who hurt her. Cassie had spent her life as an educator, 42 years in Miami's public school system, teaching English literature to students who often came from broken homes. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a surrogate mother to dozens of kids who needed stability. She'd stay after hours tutoring, pack snacks for those who came to class hungry, and write handwritten notes on report cards with phrases like, "I believe in you." She believed in the transformative power of care. That structure and affection could rewrite anyone's story. It's what made her so beloved. But when her own daughter, Lisa, fell into the spiral of addiction, Cassie's boundless compassion collided with a cruel reality. Love doesn't always heal. By the time Leo was 10, Lisa's life had unraveled completely. Years of substance abuse had stripped her of custody, her job, and eventually, her stability. Cassie fought for guardianship, not because she wanted to raise another child in her 60s, but because she couldn't bear to see him disappear into the foster system. "He's my blood," she told a social worker. "He's still got a chance." That was Cassie, stubbornly hopeful, even when hope had already packed its bags and left. She signed the papers, cleared out her guest room, and welcomed her grandson into her quiet home, believing she could give him the second chance life had denied him. At first, the house was filled with cautious laughter and small victories. Cassie redecorated the spare room with posters of constellations and model airplanes. She cooked Leo's favorite meals, enrolled him in a better school, and told her friends that he was just shy, not broken. But even then, the signs were there, subtle cracks in the facade that she mistook for growing pains. Leo had trouble sleeping. He avoided eye contact. Sometimes she'd find him sitting awake in the dark, staring at nothing. When she asked what was wrong, he'd shrug. "Just thinking," he'd say. Those early years were a delicate balancing act, Cassie trying to pour love into a vessel that refused to hold it. She set routines, established boundaries, tried to create the kind of order she thought a boy like Leo needed. Dinner at 6, homework at 7, lights out at 10. But to Leo, those rules weren't love. They were control. They reminded him of everything he'd lost: freedom, unpredictability, chaos. Cassie didn't realize it, but the very structure that gave her life meaning made Leo feel suffocated. And resentment began to bloom, quietly, like mold behind wallpaper. Still, Cassie never gave up. She attended every parent-teacher meeting, proudly telling teachers that Leo was smart, just misunderstood. When he got into fights, she defended him. When he stole small things, cash from her purse, a neighbor's headphones, she called them mistakes and made excuses. She refused to label him as bad. To her, labels were what the world used to give up on people. She believed that with enough patience, even the hardest hearts could soften. Her friends worried. One of them, a retired nurse named Evelyn Harper, recalled a conversation they had over coffee just a few months before the fire. "She looked tired," Evelyn said later. "Really tired, like she hadn't slept in weeks." I asked if Leo was still giving her trouble, and she smiled that little teacher's smile of hers, the one that hides everything, and said, "He's just going through something. I'm his grandmother. I'll get him through it." What Evelyn didn't know was that Cassie had started locking her bedroom door at night. She had begun keeping her purse inside her closet, behind a false panel. Small things around the house went missing: keys, lighters, her spare phone. One afternoon, she found burn marks on the backyard fence and a melted soda bottle half filled with lighter fluid. Leo claimed he and some friends had been experimenting with fireworks. Cassie scolded him, grounded him, but later that night she wrote in her journal, "He scares me sometimes. Not the anger, the quiet. It's like he feels nothing." And yet every entry after that ended the same way. "He's my boy. He'll come back to himself." It's easy, in hindsight, to say she should have seen the danger, to ask why she didn't call the police or alert a counselor or send him to live elsewhere. But Cassie was from another generation. A woman raised on the belief that family isn't disposable, that love is duty. She couldn't bring herself to imagine her grandson as a threat. The thought was unbearable. So she convinced herself it was just a phase, that her love was enough. By the time Leo turned 16, the cracks had become fissures. He no longer pretended to be the polite, withdrawn boy Cassie had once known. His temper was sharp, unpredictable. He spoke to her like a stranger. He stayed out late, came home smelling of smoke and gasoline, and once when she asked where he'd been, he said coldly, "You're not my mother. Stop acting like you are." That night, Cassie cried quietly in her room, the way she always did when he said things like that. She wasn't crying for herself, she was crying for the boy she thought she'd lost. She refused to see the monster he was becoming, because to do so would mean admitting her love had failed. And Cassie Phillips didn't believe in failure. Her colleagues at church noticed her absence from Sunday services in the weeks before the fire. She said she wasn't feeling well, one member recalled, but there was something in her voice, like she was holding back. She had stopped volunteering at the after-school program, claiming she needed more time at home. When asked how Leo was doing, she gave the same answer she always had. "He's trying." The truth, however, was far darker. In her final journal entries, Cassie's tone shifted from hope to fear. She wrote about finding one of her pets, a parakeet named Sunny, dead in its cage, its neck twisted. She wrote about waking up to footsteps outside her bedroom at 3 a.m. But when she called out, no one answered. She wrote about the smell of gasoline on Leo's clothes, about the way he stared at the flames in the fireplace for too long, almost entranced. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a stranger," she wrote. "But he's all I have, and maybe I'm all he has." That last line would later be read aloud in court, moments before Leo's sentencing. It silenced the entire room. Detective Marcus Wilson would later call Cassie's journals the most heartbreaking evidence he'd ever read. "It wasn't just that she saw it coming," he said. "It was that she chose to believe in him anyway. She kept loving him, even as she was afraid of him. That's what makes this case so tragic. She didn't die because she was careless. She died because she was kind." The deeper investigators dug into Cassie's world, the clearer her portrait became. A woman who tried to fix what others had broken. Her refrigerator was covered with Leo's old report cards, even the bad ones. She'd written encouraging notes on them. "Next time will be better." In her bedroom, they found a box filled with every letter Leo had written from childhood. Crayon-scrawled apologies, Mother's Day cards addressed to "My Grandma Mom," drawings of the two of them holding hands. She'd kept them all, even the last one, a short note he'd left on the kitchen counter 2 weeks before the fire. "Don't wait up. I'm figuring stuff out." Investigators would later note that the handwriting matched entries in a separate notebook found in Leo's room, the one filled with dark sketches and plans. On one page, written in the same careful hand, were the words, "Clean start." Cassie never saw that notebook. She never knew what her grandson was planning or how methodically he was erasing her from his life. All she saw was a boy she'd raised, one she still believed she could save. And that belief, that blind, stubborn love, would be her undoing. In many ways, Cassie Phillips embodied a quiet heroism that rarely makes headlines. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. But she represented something deeply human. The conviction that love can redeem even the lost. It's what made her death so haunting, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes love blinds us to danger until it's too late. On the evening before the fire, Cassie was seen sitting on her porch swing, reading under the porch light. A neighbor waved goodnight around 9:30. Cassie smiled, waved back, and went inside. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Inside, she brewed chamomile tea, folded a basket of laundry, and checked on Leo, who was in his room with his headphones on. At least that's what she thought. She went to bed around 10:30, leaving her reading glasses on the nightstand. On the dresser beside her was the alarm clock with the hidden camera, a precaution she'd told no one about. She probably thought it made her feel safer. Hours later, that tiny camera would capture the unthinkable, the shadow that moved toward her door, the faint hiss of liquid hitting the floor, and the sudden hellish glow that turned her world to flame. But those images, as devastating as they were, didn't erase who Cassie was. They preserved it. They proved that until her final breath, she was still the woman who believed love could save a child, even when that child was the one holding the match. From the outside, the Phillips home looked ordinary. A two-story suburban house painted soft yellow, framed by palms and hibiscus, its porch swing swaying lazily in the warm Miami breeze. If you passed by on a Sunday afternoon, you might have seen Cassie watering her plants, Leo raking the driveway, the smell of chicken and rosemary drifting from the kitchen window. To the neighbors, it looked like a picture of simple stability, a grandmother raising her grandson, doing her best, keeping life together. But the truth was far more complicated. Behind those white curtains, the air was heavy with tension, an invisible war between love and resentment, patience and fury, each pretending not to notice the other's existence. Cassie, ever the optimist, fought daily to preserve the illusion. She smiled for neighbors, answered teachers' calls with reassuring tones, and hosted Sunday dinners even when her hands shook from exhaustion. "He's a good boy," she'd insist when someone hinted otherwise. "He just needs time." But inside those walls, time had become her enemy. Every week, Leo's behavior escalated, small acts of rebellion that grew into something darker. He stopped eating meals with her, stopped coming home on time, started disappearing for entire nights. When he did speak to her, it was with sarcasm sharpened into cruelty. "You think you're a saint," he once told her, "but you're just lonely." That line cut deeper than he knew. Cassie was lonely, profoundly so. Her friends had grown distant, her daughter unreachable, and the boy she'd poured her life into treated her like a warden instead of family. Yet she clung to the illusion because it was all she had left. If she let the cracks show, if she admitted to herself that the home she'd built was rotting from within, then she'd have to face a truth she couldn't bear: that love had failed her. The illusion extended beyond their doorstep. At school, Leo was quiet, polite when he needed to be, invisible when he didn't. Teachers described him as intelligent but distant. One counselor remembered how he'd sit through entire sessions without speaking, just tracing patterns on the table with his finger. When asked about home, he'd say, "It's fine. My grandma's nice, just old-fashioned." The mask was seamless. He understood people. Not emotionally, but strategically. He knew what they wanted to hear, how to make them underestimate him. It wasn't charm. It was control. Cassie's version of control was different, softer, rooted in care. She kept the house spotless, clung to routines, filled every silence with small talk to avoid confronting the growing distance. When Leo began skipping school, she left notes on his bed. "I love you. Please talk to me." He ignored them. When she found a lighter in his jeans, she confiscated it quietly and said nothing. When money vanished from her wallet, she pretended she'd misplaced it. To anyone else, it might have seemed like denial, but to Cassie, it was survival. Denial was easier than despair. Neighbors started to notice strange things: lights flickering at odd hours, arguments that ended in slammed doors, Leo pacing outside in the rain, his face unreadable. "They looked normal," one neighbor told police later. But it was that kind of normal where you just know something's wrong. The illusion of family harmony had begun to crumble. Yet Cassie kept trying to patch it with kindness. "Love wins in the end," she told Evelyn Harper one afternoon. Evelyn remembered how she said it, not with conviction, but as if she were trying to convince herself. Meanwhile, Leo had started spending more time online. His search history, recovered later by investigators, painted a chilling picture of his mind unraveling. How fast fire spreads in a house. Flammable household liquids. Sleeping pills lethal dose. But mixed among the horror were ordinary things. Video game reviews, music playlists, posts about feeling trapped. It was as if two versions of Leo existed side by side. The boy who wanted to escape his pain, and the one who wanted to inflict it. Cassie wasn't blind to his turmoil, but she misunderstood it. She thought he was depressed, lonely, maybe angry at his absent mother. She wrote in her journal, "I think he blames me for Lisa's choices. I can't change what happened, but maybe I can give him something better." She started baking again, planning small surprises. His favorite dinner, new sheets for his bed, even a handwritten letter she never got the chance to give him. It ended with the words, "No matter what happens, I'll always love you." That letter was later found sealed in her dresser drawer, never opened. By the summer before the fire, the house felt more like a stage set than a home. Everything in its place, but nothing real. Cassie walked on eggshells, timing her movements to avoid confrontation. Leo's anger had become unpredictable, triggered by the smallest things. A reminder to do chores, a curfew, a look he decided was judgmental. Once, when she asked him to mow the lawn, he stared at her for a long moment and said, "Why do you even care? You're gonna die soon anyway." She laughed it off, tried to call it teenage rebellion. But that night, she locked her door and sat awake, staring at the glow of the hallway light beneath the crack. What Cassie didn't know was that Leo had begun fantasizing about freedom. Not the kind that comes from running away, but from erasing everything that reminded him of control. In his mind, the house was a symbol of all the rules, expectations, and guilt he'd inherited. He saw it as a cage built by someone who thought she could fix him. And he hated her for it, not because she was cruel, but because she was kind. To someone like Leo, kindness felt like manipulation. The illusion of family harmony was nearing its breaking point. On the outside, Cassie's home was immaculate. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, a new mailbox. But inside, the silence was deafening. Cassie filled it with TV shows she didn't watch, gospel music playing softly in the background, anything to avoid hearing the creak of Leo's footsteps upstairs. In one of her final journal entries, she wrote, "I used to pray for peace in this house. Now I just pray to wake up tomorrow." The illusion shattered completely one night in September, 2 weeks before the fire. Cassie had asked Leo about missing money from her bank account, nearly $200 withdrawn without her knowledge. He denied it, of course. The argument escalated quickly. Cassie, desperate and trembling, shouted, "You're lying to me!" And Leo, standing in the doorway, stared at her with a coldness she'd never seen before. "Maybe I am," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" He left the house that night and didn't return until morning. Cassie stayed awake until sunrise, afraid to sleep. But even after that, she couldn't let go of the illusion. When a friend suggested she send Leo to live with relatives or enroll him in counseling, she shook her head. "He needs consistency," she said. "He needs me." The words were meant as reassurance, but in truth they were a confession. She needed him just as much. He was her last tie to family, to purpose, to the belief that her love still mattered. In many ways, Cassie's home had become a metaphor for her heart, well kept on the outside, fractured within. She'd spent her life teaching children how to build better futures, yet she couldn't save the one child who needed her most. That irony, cruel and poetic, would haunt those who knew her long after her death. Because the illusion she fought to maintain, the illusion of a perfect, loving family, was not just her prison, it was her tragedy. When investigators later reconstructed the final weeks of Cassie's life, they noticed something chilling in the timeline. Every act of kindness she made, every attempt to repair the relationship, was mirrored by Leo's growing cruelty. It was as if he drew strength from her forgiveness, feeding off it. The more she loved him, the more power he felt. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all. Her compassion didn't save him. It enabled him. The Phillips home, with its yellow walls and white trim, stood for nearly a month after the fire, blackened and hollowed, a grim monument to what once looked like an ordinary family. Neighbors passed by in silence, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. The illusion was gone, replaced by the smell of ash and the echo of questions no one could answer. How does love turn into fear? How does devotion become destruction? And how does a boy who once called his grandmother Mom become the architect of her death? No one had answers then. But as the investigation deepened, the truth began to surface. One painful piece at a time. Hidden journals, deleted searches, a gas can purchased at midnight, and soon, a discovery so disturbing it would forever destroy any remaining illusion of innocence. Because the night Cassie installed that clock camera, she unknowingly set the stage for her final act. It would be that footage, raw, silent, and irrefutable, that stripped away the illusion entirely, exposing the darkness that had been growing under her roof all along. October 3rd, 2022, began like any other humid Miami evening. A low orange sun sinking behind the skyline, the air heavy with the scent of rain and cut grass. Cassie Phillips woke up early that morning, made tea, and called her friend Evelyn to chat about Sunday plans. Her voice sounded tired but warm, the way it always did when she was trying to convince everyone, maybe even herself, that things were fine. She spent the afternoon cleaning, humming softly to an old gospel tune as she folded laundry. At 5 p.m., she set out 2 plates on the kitchen table, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, her grandson's favorite meal. But only one was touched. Leo didn't come downstairs. She called up once, twice, then gave up. By now, that kind of silence had become routine. Upstairs, in the dim light of his room, Leo Phillips sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. His expression was calm, almost meditative. He wasn't thinking about dinner. He wasn't thinking about school. He was thinking about control. How tonight, for the first time in his life, he would decide what happened. No rules, no guilt, no grandmother hovering over him with her soft voice and softer eyes. He'd spent weeks building toward this moment, rehearsing it in his mind like a movie scene. The sound of the lighter clicking open, the sight of flames blooming against the walls, the look, or maybe the scream, that would never come soon enough. At 7:43 p.m., he left the house for a walk, telling Cassie he needed air. She smiled, relieved he was speaking to her again, and said, "Don't be long, sweetheart." He nodded without meeting her eyes. As he walked down Banyan Drive, the streetlights flickering on one by one, he felt something close to peace. There was no anger anymore, no hesitation, just a cold certainty that this night would end with everything wiped clean. Surveillance footage later showed Leo entering a nearby convenience store at 11:07 p.m. He moved casually, bought a red plastic gas can and 2 energy drinks, paid in cash. The clerk remembered his politeness. He even said thank you, the man told investigators. That politeness, that small, meaningless gesture would haunt him for weeks. Because at that very moment, Cassie was already asleep. Her reading glasses folded on the nightstand, a book half open beside her, the hum of her old ceiling fan lulling her into a fragile peace. Just before midnight, the security camera in Cassie's room, the one disguised as a digital alarm clock, flickered to life. What it captured would later become Exhibit A in the trial, a silent, grainy window into pure horror. The footage begins with stillness. Cassie is asleep, the faint glow of her bedside lamp washing the room in amber light. The door creaks slightly, just enough to make the shadows shift. Then, in the corner of the frame, a figure appears. Small at first, still, watching. Leo moves with eerie precision, his silhouette calm, methodical. He carries something, a container. He kneels beside the bed, careful not to make a sound. For a moment, he just stares at her, his own grandmother, the woman who'd fed him, clothed him, defended him against the world. There's no hesitation, no visible conflict. Then, slowly, he unscrews the cap of the gas can. The faint shimmer of liquid catches the light. He begins to pour. It's almost impossible to watch, even in silence. He moves around the bed, tracing lines of accelerant across the carpet, the curtains, the dresser. Every movement is deliberate, almost ritualistic. When he's done, he pauses again, the camera catching the faint rise and fall of his chest. He looks toward Cassie one last time. Then, with the calm of someone flicking on a light switch, he strikes the lighter. The ignition is instant, a violent bloom of orange that engulfs the room in seconds. Cassie wakes, startled, confused. The footage blurs as smoke fills the lens. She reaches for the door, but it doesn't move. It's locked from the outside. The last visible image on that recording is the flickering glow of the flames reflected in the mirror and the faint outline of a figure stepping away from the doorway. By 12:10 a.m., the fire had already devoured half the house. Neighbors later said they heard popping sounds like fireworks, followed by a woman's scream that was cut short by a crash. One neighbor, Maria Torres, called 911. Her voice trembling can still be heard on the dispatch tape. "The Phillips house. It's burning. Someone's inside." When first responders arrived minutes later, the inferno was unstoppable. The flames had consumed everything flammable and found more. The heat was so fierce that even approaching the front door was nearly impossible. Firefighters broke through windows, shouted Cassie's name, and were answered only by the roar of the blaze. And through it all, sitting across the street, calm and motionless, was Leo Phillips, barefoot, hoodie drawn tight around his face, eyes fixed on the house. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't run toward the fire. He simply sat there, bathed in its light. Later, one firefighter said that when he first saw Leo, he thought the boy was in shock. "He looked frozen," he said. "But the longer I watched, the more I realized he wasn't frozen. He was focused." That word, focused, would echo throughout the trial. When police arrived to question witnesses, Leo answered every question with composure that unsettled even seasoned officers. "I came home and saw the fire," he said. "I tried to open the door, but it was too hot. She was asleep when I left earlier." His story was simple, plausible, almost too neat. He spoke softly, even thanked the officers for trying to help. One paramedic offered him a blanket. He declined. "I'm not cold," he said. Detective Marcus Wilson, who had been asleep when the call came through, arrived on scene at dawn. The fire had been extinguished hours earlier, but the air still smelled of burnt wood and gasoline. What was left of the house looked skeletal, black beams jutting into a gray sky. Wilson surveyed the scene, his boots crunching over wet debris. Then he saw Leo. The boy was sitting on the curb, head bowed, expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Wilson felt a pang of sympathy. Another child orphaned by tragedy, he thought. But when Leo lifted his eyes, that sympathy evaporated. There was nothing in them, no grief, no confusion, just calculation. Investigators worked the scene meticulously. The fire patterns were too symmetrical, the burn too fast. It didn't behave like an accidental fire. It behaved like one guided by human hands. The strongest ignition point was near Cassie's bed, with clear traces of accelerant radiating outward. And when they examined the front door, they found deep grooves near the lock, as if something had been wedged against it from the outside. Later that morning, Wilson sat in his car, reviewing his notes. He kept glancing back toward Leo, who was now drinking from a bottle of water, his posture relaxed. Wilson couldn't shake a single, unrelenting thought. This kid planned it. He didn't have proof yet, but his instincts, the same instincts honed over 2 decades of homicide work, screamed that what he'd just witnessed wasn't grief. It was satisfaction. Meanwhile, forensic teams uncovered the first undeniable clue, a melted plastic fragment near the back porch. Chemical analysis confirmed it came from a standard red gas can, the same type sold at the Shell station a mile away, the same one caught on security footage hours earlier. When Wilson saw the timestamp, 11:07 p.m., his stomach turned. That was less than an hour before the blaze. By midday, as smoke still curled from the ruins of 1428 Banyan Drive, the pieces of Leo's story began to unravel. A neighbor's home camera caught him walking up the driveway shortly before midnight. Another captured him leaving just minutes before the first flames appeared. And the coup de grace, Cassie's hidden camera, sealed everything. When detectives viewed the footage for the first time, the room fell silent. Even the most hardened officers struggled to watch. There was no doubt anymore. The calm, the precision, the lack of hesitation, it was all there. And yet, what disturbed them most wasn't the act itself, but what came after. When Leo stepped out of that room, the video caught a final glimpse of him pausing in the hallway. He looked back once, not in fear, not in regret, but as though admiring his own creation. Then he walked away. Hours later, as the fire consumed everything, Cassie's neighbors gathered outside in horror. The heat was unbearable, forcing them back across the street. Leo sat among them, quiet, unmoved. One witness said she saw him smile, just for a second, when the roof collapsed. By dawn, the fire was out. The illusion of an accidental tragedy was gone. And though Leo didn't know it yet, the very camera his grandmother had installed to protect herself would become the silent witness that spoke louder than any confession. The night of the fire marked the end of Cassie Phillips's story and the beginning of Leo's downfall. From that point on, everything he'd built, every lie, every mask, every illusion of innocence would start to crumble under the weight of truth. And yet, in the days that followed, Leo still believed he could control it. He gave interviews, stood beside detectives, even attended Cassie's memorial service where he bowed his head and whispered to reporters, "She was the only one who cared about me." The cameras loved it. The public pitied him. For a fleeting moment, the boy who had set the fire became the boy who survived it. But Detective Marcus Wilson wasn't fooled. As he stood in front of the charred remains of Cassie's home, he made himself a silent promise. "I'll find every piece of this, every lie, every spark, and I'll make sure she gets justice." The fire had started as Leo's act of control, but it would end as Marcus Wilson's obsession. By the morning after the fire, Detective Marcus Wilson was running on caffeine and instinct. The sun rose pale and indifferent over Coconut Grove, glinting off the wet pavement where firefighters had stood the night before. Steam still rose from the smoldering debris of Cassie Phillips's home, a ghostly mist curling through the blackened frame. To most, it looked like an accident scene finally at rest. To Wilson, it looked like a crime scene whispering for attention. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that fires could lie, but burn patterns never did. They told stories if you knew how to read them, and this one was already shouting. The first story the evidence told was about control. The origin points weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern, tracing a path that blocked exits and surrounded the bed. This wasn't panic or impulse, it was choreography. Whoever said it had known the layout of the house intimately. They'd known where Cassie slept, where the windows latched, how long it would take for smoke to fill the room. Wilson took a slow breath, the metallic scent of ash catching in his throat, and looked once more at the faint shoe prints preserved in soot leading toward the street. He already knew whose they were, but he needed proof strong enough to silence even the cleverest defense lawyer. Back at headquarters, The task force room smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. Maps of the neighborhood were pinned to the wall, red strings linking addresses, timestamps, and fragments of surveillance footage. The case file was already thick: photos of the burned bedroom, close-ups of melted plastic, still frames of a shadow moving along the side of the house. Wilson briefed his team. "We're not calling it arson yet, but treat it like it is." He didn't say the name on everyone's mind. He didn't have to. Over the next 48 hours, forensic analysts combed through every inch of debris. They recovered fragments of the red gas can, confirmed gasoline residue, and pulled the metal hinge from the bedroom door. It bore traces of melted plastic consistent with a lock jammed from outside. The arson specialist, Janet Crowley, summarized it bluntly. "Whoever did this wanted her trapped, no doubt." Wilson nodded, jaw tightening. He'd expected as much, but hearing it said aloud gave the crime a terrible finality. This wasn't a fire. It was premeditation by flame. Meanwhile, the interviews began. Neighbors described Leo's odd calmness, his refusal of help, the blank look in his eyes as the house burned. Friends from school were called in. One, a quiet kid named Jason Miller, said Leo had been at his house earlier that night. But when pressed for the exact time he'd left, Jason faltered. "I think around 10:30, he said. "He said he was going to walk home." That small discrepancy cracked Leo's timeline wide open. The fire started close to midnight. He'd had plenty of time to buy gasoline, return, and set everything in motion. By the third day, Wilson finally got the search warrant he'd been waiting for. When he entered Leo's bedroom, the air was stale, heavy with teenage clutter, posters half peeled from the wall, empty soda cans, a video game controller tangled in its cord. But beneath the ordinary mess lay something darker. In the bottom drawer of the desk, detectives found a sketchbook. Its cover was scorched at the edges, but the drawings inside were intact. Pages filled with flames, houses collapsing, figures standing in front of them, watching. One page was labeled "Clean Start." Another showed a crude floor plan that bore an uncanny resemblance to Cassie's house. Wilson closed the book carefully, the way one handles evidence and grief at the same time. "Bag it," he said quietly. They found more: a half-empty lighter fluid bottle under the bed, a hoodie with faint chemicals staining along the sleeves, and a notebook containing math-like calculations, fuel ratios, burn times, even temperature estimates scribbled in the margins. Each discovery tightened the noose a little further. When Leo was brought in for a second interview, the tone had changed. The soft empathy from the first meeting was gone. Wilson greeted him with professional calm. "We're just clearing up a few details," he said. Leo nodded, polite as ever. The interrogation room was small, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. For the first half hour, Leo stuck to his story. He'd been at Jason's, came home to a burning house, tried to help. Wilson listened patiently, occasionally scribbling notes. Then he slid a photo across the table, the grainy surveillance still from the Shell station. "You want to explain this?" he asked. Leo stared at it for several seconds, expression unreadable. "That's not me," he said finally. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Security footage says otherwise. You paid cash. Clerk remembers you. You even used your student ID." He paused, letting the words settle. "That was about an hour before your grandmother's house caught fire." For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Leo's face. Not fear, annoyance, as if the detective were wasting his time. "I bought gas for Jason's dirt bike," he said smoothly. "We were supposed to ride this weekend." Wilson leaned forward. "You sure you want to stick with that?" Leo met his gaze, unblinking. "You don't have anything." That quiet arrogance both fascinated and repulsed Wilson. It was the same tone he'd heard from seasoned criminals twice Leo's age. The boy wasn't denying with innocence. He was daring the detective to prove him wrong. Over the next week, the investigation accelerated. Forensics cross-referenced the gasoline's chemical signature with samples from the scene. It was an identical match to the brand sold at the Shell station. Cassie's clock camera was recovered from the wreckage and sent to the digital forensics lab. When technicians finally retrieved the footage, everyone in the room fell silent. The video wasn't long, but it told the whole story. Wilson watched once, jaw clenched, then quietly left the room. "No one should have to see that twice," he muttered. With the evidence in hand, the department moved quickly. Leo was arrested at his temporary foster placement on October 10th, exactly 1 week after the fire. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. When Wilson read him his rights, Leo only said, "I knew you'd figure it out." The statement wasn't defeat. It sounded almost admiring, as if he respected the detective for keeping up. The media frenzy began within hours. Headlines screamed, "Teen charged with grandmother's murder." Old photos surfaced. Leo as a smiling boy beside Cassie at a school play, both laughing, unaware of the shadow years ahead. Comment sections filled with outrage and disbelief. How could a child do something like this? What kind of evil could live behind those calm eyes? But Wilson had long since stopped asking how. The real question was why. That why consumed him. He pored through Leo's school records, therapy reports, disciplinary notes. Patterns emerged: early signs of conduct disorder, fascination with fire, manipulative behavior masked by charm. Teachers described him as gifted but detached. Counselors wrote about limited empathy response. It wasn't madness, not exactly. It was emptiness. An emotional void shaped by years of abandonment and resentment. In the evidence locker, the items from Leo's room sat sealed in plastic bags: the sketchbook, the notebook, the hoodie. Wilson visited often, rereading the notes like chapters of a diary written in gasoline and ink. He began to see a chilling logic in Leo's thinking. Each entry building toward that one night, every calculation a step closer to freedom as he defined it. Freedom from rules, from guilt, from Cassie. The prosecution team worked tirelessly, building a narrative as clean and airtight as the fire had been deliberate. Motive, resentment, and control, means gasoline and planning, opportunity, documented timeline. The case was horrifyingly solid. Yet amid the growing certainty, Wilson found himself haunted by Cassie's journals. He'd read them cover to cover, tracing her descent from hope to fear. The entries weren't just evidence, they were testimony. In her handwriting lived the sound of a woman pleading with herself to keep believing in love. Sometimes, late at night, Wilson would reread one line: "He's my boy. He'll come back to himself." He wondered if she believed that even as the flames rose. As weeks turned into months, the case became a national obsession. News anchors dissected every new development. Psychologists debated Leo's mental state on talk shows. Was he born without empathy, or had life stripped it away? Wilson avoided the cameras. He wasn't interested in theories. He wanted justice, the kind Cassie never stopped giving. When the indictment was finally filed, first-degree murder, arson, and aggravated cruelty, the courtroom filled with reporters. Leo, now in an orange jumpsuit, looked almost angelic under the harsh fluorescent lights. Youthful, pale, unbothered. He smiled faintly as photographers' flashes reflected off the glass. Some described it as nerves. Wilson knew better. That was pride. The investigation had ended. The story it uncovered was more horrific than any fiction. A woman's faith destroyed by the very love she refused to withdraw, a boy who mistook mercy for weakness, and a detective whose determination turned grief into justice. But for Wilson, closure was a myth. The case had burrowed too deep. Sometimes he still smelled the smoke when there was none, still saw the flicker of flame behind closed eyelids. The investigation had revealed the truth, but truth rarely brings peace. It only shows you the full shape of the darkness, and Leo's darkness was only beginning to unfold. By the time the world learned the name Leo Phillips, the story had already mutated from tragedy into something mythic, the perfect storm of horror, youth, and betrayal. News anchors didn't just report on the crime, they dissected it. Talk shows debated whether a 16-year-old could truly comprehend evil. Social media erupted with outrage and fascination. People wanted to know what kind of monster could look his grandmother in the eye and set her world on fire. But in truth, Leo Phillips didn't fit the monster mold. He didn't snarl, didn't lash out, didn't fit the stereotype of a violent teen. That was what made him so frightening. His calmness was his weapon. In the days following his arrest, the state ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. The lead psychologist, Dr. Karen Lutz, was a veteran of juvenile criminal cases, but she admitted afterward that Leo unsettled her more than anyone she'd ever met. "He spoke with the vocabulary of a college student and the emotional range of a stone," she said. During their first session, he sat perfectly upright, hands folded, voice even. "I know why I'm here," he told her. "You're trying to figure out if I'm crazy or evil." When she asked which one he thought he was, he smiled faintly. "Maybe neither." What struck Lutz most wasn't what Leo said, but what he didn't. He never once expressed remorse. He didn't deny the act, not exactly, but he distanced himself from it, as though describing something that had happened to someone else. "I was watching myself," he said at one point, "like a movie I'd already seen." To her trained ear, it sounded like detachment, possibly dissociation, but the more she observed him, the less she believed he was disconnected. He was calculating. He wanted to be understood, but on his terms. He wanted control, even over how others perceived his lack of humanity. The reports from those sessions painted a portrait that was chilling in its precision. Leo displayed traits consistent with conduct disorder and emerging psychopathy. Manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, shallow emotional responses, and a fascination with destruction. But beyond the clinical jargon was something harder to define, an awareness of his own nature. He wasn't oblivious to his darkness. He embraced it. He saw it as proof of superiority. When Dr. Lutz asked if he missed Cassie, his response was almost tender. "She was good," he said quietly. "Too good. She didn't understand that goodness doesn't protect you." Lutz pressed further. "Did you love her?" Leo tilted his head, thoughtful. "Love is wanting someone to stay," he said. "I wanted her to stop." That sentence lingered in the air long after he said it. It was the closest he ever came to an explanation. Back at the precinct, Detective Marcus Wilson followed every psychological report with grim fascination. He'd seen sociopaths before, grown men who killed without flinching, but never someone so young, so eerily articulate about his emptiness. In his notes, Wilson wrote, "Leo doesn't lack intelligence. He lacks conscience. It's like he learned empathy as an equation, how to mimic it when needed." That observation would later be echoed by the prosecution's expert witnesses, who described Leo's behavior as performative empathy, the ability to counterfeit human feeling for strategic purposes. In the weeks before trial, Leo's attorneys debated how to present him. Should they argue diminished capacity, childhood trauma, chemical imbalance? But Leo himself seemed uninterested. "I'm not broken," he told his lawyer. "I just don't care the way you do." Those words would later be quoted in open court, and when the jury heard them, a chill swept through the room. The press branded him the boy without remorse. Yet the real story was more complicated. Leo had not grown up in chaos. Not entirely. Cassie had loved him fiercely. She'd given him structure, affection, safety. But inside him, something had calcified early. A belief that vulnerability was weakness, that control was power. Psychologists later theorized that his mother's addiction and abandonment had carved a wound he refused to feel, so he filled it with dominance. When Cassie tried to guide him, he saw it as control. When she forgave him, he saw it as submission. Every act of love became a test of power. In one recorded interview, Wilson asked Leo, "Do you think what you did was wrong?" Leo paused, eyes lowered. "I think most people would say it was wrong," he said. Wilson pressed, "And what do you say?" Leo looked up then, the faintest smirk curling at his lips. "I say it worked." It was the kind of statement that froze even seasoned officers. Not because it was cruel, but because it was logical. To Leo, morality was irrelevant, a social rule, not a truth. The fire hadn't been about rage. It was about control, pure and clean. He hadn't wanted Cassie dead out of hatred. He wanted to erase the part of his world that refused to bend to him. Dr. Lutz later described him as a chilling study in rational evil. He didn't kill out of impulse or emotion. He killed to prove a theory, that he could and that doing so would make him free. It's the kind of thinking rarely seen outside academic profiles of adult psychopaths. But Leo was 16. He'd just learned to drive. And yet he understood manipulation with the precision of a con artist twice his age. The deeper investigators dug into his notebooks and drawings, the more his mindset came into focus. One page contained lists, reasons to do it and reasons not to. Under the first list, he'd written silence, control, clean start. Under reasons not to, there was only one word: nothing. That single word became symbolic of the void inside him, the emotional vacuum that no amount of love could fill. The defense brought in their own experts to counter the psychopathy claims. They argued Leo was a product of trauma, that his mother's neglect and the instability of his early years had left him emotionally stunted. "He's not evil," one doctor said in court. "He's broken." But the prosecution's expert countered sharply. Evil and broken can coexist. As the legal battle unfolded, Wilson found himself haunted not by the evidence, but by the boy himself. He kept thinking about that night on the curb, how Leo sat so still, bathed in the light of the flames. "That look," he said later, "wasn't panic or sorrow. It was peace, like he was finally at rest." That peace terrified him more than any scream could. The case forced Wilson to confront something he'd long avoided: the uncomfortable idea that some people simply lack what makes the rest of us human. He'd always believed environment shaped behavior, that cruelty came from suffering. But Leo didn't fit that mold. He was the absence of empathy made flesh, a reminder that sometimes darkness isn't learned, it's born. Still, Wilson couldn't bring himself to see Leo as a monster. Monsters are chaotic, driven by hunger or rage. Leo was something colder, a human void, a mirror reflecting nothing. "He's what happens when love meets the wrong kind of mind," Wilson said quietly to a colleague one night. Cassie tried to build a heart where there was just calculation. In the courtroom, Leo's demeanor only deepened that impression. He never fidgeted, never broke eye contact. When prosecutors played the footage from Cassie's clock camera, the jury gasped, some even cried. Leo didn't blink. He watched his own crime play out like a movie scene, impassive, analytical. When asked afterward what he felt seeing it, he replied, "It looks worse than it felt." That line, perhaps more than any other, sealed his fate. It revealed a truth even his lawyers couldn't spin, that empathy was a foreign language he'd never learned. Psychologists who studied the case later described it as a textbook example of callous, unemotional traits, a clinical term for what most people would simply call evil. But definitions don't bring comfort. They only name the darkness. What made Leo so disturbing wasn't just what he'd done, it was how he understood it. He didn't see murder as moral collapse. He saw it as problem-solving. To this day, researchers still cite the Phillips case in studies on juvenile psychopathy. They debate whether Leo's brain chemistry, upbringing, or sheer indifference birthed the fire that night. But to those who stood in that courtroom, to Detective Wilson, to Cassie's friends, to the jurors who stared into the eyes of a boy who'd burned his grandmother alive, the answer didn't matter. The result was the same. Leo Phillips had become something no one could fully explain. A child untouched by love, unshaken by guilt, and unmoved by flame. And in his mind, that made him perfect. The courthouse in downtown Miami was already surrounded by cameras before dawn. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes aimed skyward like mechanical sunflowers. The crowd that gathered outside wasn't angry so much as hungry. Hungry for answers, for justice, for a glimpse of the pale teenager whose face had haunted every screen for months. Inside, beneath the humming fluorescent lights and the scent of coffee and paper, a different kind of heat built. For the first time since the fire, Leo Phillips was going to speak in public. He entered the courtroom in an oversized suit borrowed from the juvenile detention center, the sleeves brushing his wrists. His hair was neatly combed, his posture immaculate. He looked more like a student preparing for a debate than a defendant on trial for murder. When the bailiff called the room to order, Leo glanced at the gallery just long enough to meet the eyes of a few strangers, then looked away. No family members sat behind him. Cassie Phillips had been his only living relative. The absence itself felt like a verdict. Judge Mariana Torres presided, a woman known for her composure and her intolerance for theatrics. Yet even she hesitated before reading the charges aloud: first-degree murder, arson, aggravated cruelty, premeditation of a dependent adult. The words hung in the still air like smoke. When she asked how the defendant pleaded, Leo's voice was calm, almost pleasant. Not guilty. The two words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a script. A few reporters scribbled smirked while speaking in their notes. The prosecution began with the footage. They didn't ease into it. They ripped the curtain away. On the large monitor, the grainy video from Cassie's hidden camera flickered to life. Jurors leaned forward, expressions hardening, as the shadowed figure moved through the bedroom. When the flames bloomed, the courtroom filled with gasps. One juror covered her mouth, another turned away. The sound was muted, but it didn't need audio. The images were enough. Through it all, Leo watched impassively, eyes fixed on the screen. When the video ended, he blinked once, slowly, and looked down at the table as if the scene had bored him. Prosecutor Elliot Brandt, a man with 30 years in homicide, spoke without theatrics. He didn't need them. This was not rage, he told the jury. This was design. You will see evidence of planning, of control, of a young man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. He paced slowly, letting silence fill the spaces between his words. Cassie Phillips opened her home, her heart, her life to this boy, and he repaid her with fire. The defense countered with a narrative of tragedy and trauma. Leo, they argued, was a child born into chaos, shaped by abandonment and emotional neglect. His actions, they said, were not born of evil, but of psychological collapse. He is not a monster, defense attorney Rachel Mendez told the jury. He is a broken human being. She spoke of his mother's addiction, the years of instability, the impossible expectations placed on him by a loving but overbearing guardian. He needed help, she said softly. What he got was isolation. The courtroom became a theater of contrasts. On one side, the state painted Leo as methodical and remorseless. On the other, his lawyers described him as a fragile boy who'd lost his way. But Leo himself blurred those lines. When witnesses spoke about Cassie, her kindness, her patience, her laughter, he showed no reaction. When the defense psychiatrist described his emotional detachment, he nodded almost proudly. It was as if he wanted both sides to be right, brilliant and broken, cruel and misunderstood. Detective Marcus Wilson took the stand on the third day. His testimony was measured but heavy, every detail carved from months of sleepless nights. He described the burn patterns, the accelerant traces, the surveillance footage from the gas station. When the prosecutor asked what had struck him most about Leo that night, Wilson hesitated. "The calm," he said. "I've seen shock. I've seen grief. This wasn't either. He was in control. He wanted to see what he'd done." His words drew a murmur from the gallery. Leo didn't flinch. Cross-examination tried to rattle Wilson. The defense suggested he'd projected guilt onto a traumatized teenager. Wilson held steady. "You can't project accelerant residue," he said simply. "You can't fake buying gasoline an hour before a fire." The jurors wrote it down. Over the following week, psychologists, forensic experts, and character witnesses took the stand. Dr. Karen Lutz spoke carefully, aware that every phrase would echo in headlines. "Leo displays traits consistent with psychopathy," she explained. "That does not mean he cannot understand right from wrong. It means he understands it and doesn't care." A collective shiver ran through the room. Even the defense team avoided meeting her eyes. When it was finally Leo's turn to testify, the atmosphere shifted. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but transcripts later captured the surreal quality of his words. He spoke clearly, confidently, like a student explaining a project. "I didn't want her to suffer," he said at one point. "I just wanted it to stop." The prosecutor asked, "Stop what?" "The noise," Leo replied. "What noise?" He thought for a moment. "The kind you can't hear," he said. "The kind in your head when someone keeps trying to fix you." That line became the trial's headline quote, and its quiet confession. Brandt leaned forward, voice low. "So you decided the solution was fire?" Leo's answer was almost whispered. "It's clean." The jury stared at him as though trying to decipher whether they were hearing philosophy or madness. Even Judge Torres's composure faltered. She reached for her pen twice before remembering she was already holding it. Outside, the public's reaction was split. Some saw Leo as proof of inherent evil. Others pitied him, calling him a product of a failed system. But inside the courtroom, the evidence left little room for debate. The gas purchase, the sketches, the lock jammed from outside, the footage, each fact was another nail in a coffin he'd built himself. Closing arguments felt almost ceremonial. Brandt's voice carried the weight of finality. Cassie Phillips believed in forgiveness. She believed love could save her grandson. But love cannot save you from someone who feels nothing. It can only blind you long enough for them to strike. When he finished, even the defense looked subdued. Mendez stood for her final plea, hands trembling slightly. "You can choose to see Leo Phillips as a monster," she said. "Or you can choose to see him as a warning of what happens when pain is ignored, when children are left alone in silence too long." Her voice softened. "Either way, we have all failed." It was a human argument, heartfelt and doomed. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room held its breath as the foreperson stood. "Guilty on all counts." There was no outburst, no cry, just the quiet shifting of chairs and the sound of one woman in the gallery weeping softly. Leo's expression never changed. He nodded once as if acknowledging an expected result. When Judge Torres read the sentence, 70 years without parole, Leo looked straight ahead, eyes distant. No apology, no tears, not even surprise. The judge's voice trembled slightly when she said, "May you spend these years finding the humanity you took from another." He blinked once, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor." That small, polite reply broke something in the room. Reporters later described an almost physical chill that swept through everyone present, as if the air itself recoiled. Wilson sat in the back row, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the boy he'd spent months chasing. For all his experience, he'd never seen anyone accept judgment with such serenity. He realized then that for Leo, punishment wasn't loss. It was confirmation, proof that he'd controlled the story to the very end. When deputies led him away, flashes burst through the courtroom doors. One photographer caught the final image that would appear on every front page the next morning. Leo Phillips, glancing over his shoulder, eyes calm, lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. The trial was over. Justice, by every legal definition, had been served. Yet no one left that courtroom feeling victorious. The verdict didn't erase the smoke that still lingered in memory, or the echo of Cassie Phillips's quiet faith. It only underlined the tragedy at the heart of the case, that a woman who believed love could save anything had met a soul that could not be reached at all. The gavel struck once, and the sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. For a moment, no one moved. Reporters froze in their seats, pens mid-air, as if the words "guilty on all counts" needed time to sink in. The courtroom had been a place of noise for weeks, shuffling papers, murmured objections, the mechanical rhythm of testimony, but now it felt like the air itself had been drained away. Judge Torres's voice carried softly through the stillness. "The defendant will rise for sentencing." Leo stood. The oversized suit hung loose on his narrow frame, the orange wristband of the detention center just visible at his cuff. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the jury. His eyes fixed somewhere above the spectators' heads, as if he could see a world beyond the walls. When Torres read the sentence, 70 years without the possibility of parole, her tone was steady, but her hands tightened around the papers in front of her. "This court hopes," she said, "that time will teach you what conscience did not." The words fell like stones into a well that had no bottom. Reporters later described the sound that followed. Not a gasp, not applause, but a strange collective exhale, as though the entire room had been holding its breath for the last 6 months. Detective Marcus Wilson closed his notebook and didn't look up. He'd known this was coming, but he'd never prepared for the weight of hearing it spoken aloud. Justice, in theory, should feel like relief. In practice, it felt like grief with paperwork attached. Leo's reaction was almost imperceptible. A slow nod, the faintest curve of his lips. He thanked the judge in the same calm tone he'd used when thanking officers for water the night of the fire. Then he turned toward the deputies waiting to escort him out. His steps were measured, almost graceful. No slumped shoulders, no resistance, just quiet acceptance. To those watching, it was unnerving. The poise of someone who had learned that emotion is a language meant for other people. Outside the courthouse, the Florida heat pressed down on the crowd. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. "Do you feel remorse? Why did you do it? Do you regret killing your grandmother?" Leo walked between 2 officers, his expression unchanged, the noise around him fading into a blur of microphones and camera flashes. The footage aired that night across every network. The pale boy in handcuffs, the calm eyes, the faint smile. For some viewers, it was evidence of evil. For others, it was the image of a system that had failed to see the cracks early enough to stop him. In the weeks that followed, the trial became less about Leo himself and more about what he represented. Talk shows debated nature versus nurture. Editorial columns quoted scripture and neuroscience in the same breath. "Can empathy be taught?" one headline asked. Another simply read, "The boy who felt nothing." Everyone wanted to turn the story into an answer for something larger: parenting, morality, mental health. But none of those discussions reached the people who had actually lived it. Detective Wilson avoided interviews. He declined documentaries, refused speaking invitations, and ignored the growing pile of requests for comment. He had no interest in becoming the story's narrator. The case had already taken up enough space in his life. At night, he'd still wake to the smell of burnt wood, the sound of distant sirens that weren't there. Sometimes he imagined Cassie's voice, soft and steady, reading from her journal. "He's my boy. He'll come back to himself." He'd whisper into the dark, "I'm sorry," though he didn't know to whom, to her, to himself, or to the idea of justice that never feels complete. Cassie's friends held a small memorial at her church a month after the sentencing. The building was modest, whitewashed, with stained glass that cast gentle colors on the worn wooden pews. Evelyn Harper stood at the podium, voice trembling as she spoke. "Cassie believed goodness could change anything," she said, "and maybe it still can. Because even now we're all here, talking about kindness, about how it mattered to her." A photo of Cassie rested beside a vase of lilies. In it, she was laughing, eyes squinting behind her glasses, the kind of unposed joy that feels eternal. When Evelyn finished, the congregation sat in silence. No one mentioned Leo by name, but his absence was everywhere. It lingered in the unspoken questions. Could she have saved him? Could anyone? The choir sang softly, their voices rising like smoke toward the rafters. Outside, a warm wind rustled the palm trees, scattering fallen blossoms across the church steps. Meanwhile, Leo began his life behind concrete walls. Juvenile offenders serving adult sentences were housed separately at first, but isolation eventually gave way to routine, breakfast trays, head counts, the echo of metal doors. Guards said he adjusted quickly. He spent most days reading, rarely speaking unless addressed. He caused no trouble, followed every rule. "It's like he's waiting," one officer said. "But for what? I don't know." The prison psychiatrist reported similar impressions. "He's not remorseful, but he's not defiant either. He's observing." Letters started arriving from strangers, some condemning him, others pleading for him to find redemption. He never replied. When asked why, he said simply, "They're writing to someone who doesn't exist." Whether he meant the boy who'd lived with Cassie or the person who'd burned her alive, no one could tell. For the city of Miami, the case left a mark that outlasted the headlines. It sparked conversations about juvenile justice, about the limits of rehabilitation, about the illusion that love alone can cure darkness. Schools held seminars, churches preached forgiveness, and parents double-checked the locks on their bedroom doors without admitting why. The story became cautionary, almost folkloric, a modern parable whispered in lowered voices. The boy who burned the woman who loved him too much. But for Marcus Wilson, it was never folklore. It was a face he couldn't forget. Sometimes he'd drive past what was left of Banyan Drive. The lot where Cassie's house once stood had been cleared, grass growing over the foundation, the silence broken only by the rustle of palms. He'd park there for a while, engine idling, listening to the wind. He said it felt like the ground itself was holding its breath. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he got out of the car and walked to where her porch had been. He bent down and pressed his hand to the earth, the heat of the day fading into the soil. "We got him," he whispered. Then he paused. "But I don't think that helps." In the years that followed, Wilson would retire early. He told colleagues he was tired, but those who knew him understood it wasn't exhaustion. It was disillusionment, the kind that comes from realizing that truth doesn't undo suffering and justice doesn't always feel like salvation. He'd done his job, followed every lead, built a case airtight enough to withstand any appeal. And yet, each time he closed his eyes, he still saw that boy on the curb, still and silent, watching the flames. Some nights, he'd catch himself wondering what 70 years meant for someone who'd never truly lived. Leo would be in his 80s when, if, he ever walked free. Did a person like that age, he wondered? Or did they just continue existing, frozen in the moment where the fire began? He'd never know. Leo had vanished into the system, a ghost in orange, one inmate among thousands. But Cassie's story endured. Teachers at her old school started a scholarship in her name, the Cassie Phillips Foundation for At-Risk Youth. Its mission was simple: to help children before they fell through the cracks. The first recipient was a quiet girl who wanted to become a social worker. At the ceremony, Evelyn read a line from Cassie's last journal entry. "Even when love fails, keep trying, because one day, someone else will get it right." The crowd stood in silence, many wiping tears. It was the kind of moment Cassie would have loved. Simple, hopeful, real. As for Leo, the world slowly moved on. New crimes replaced his in headlines. New tragedies filled the cycle. But in the archives of Miami-Dade County, his name remained stamped across thousands of pages: reports, testimonies, psychological analyses, each documenting the anatomy of a crime that began not with hatred, but with emptiness. And in that emptiness lay the quiet, terrible truth of the verdict. You can punish an act, you can confine a body, but there are some fires no sentence can ever extinguish. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal stories, but not this one. Years passed, and still the name Leo Phillips hovered like smoke over Miami's humid skyline. The fire that had taken Cassie Phillips's life was long extinguished, but its heat lingered, not in ashes or court transcripts, but in memory, in whispered retellings, in the quiet moments when people found themselves wondering how something so horrific could have come from something so ordinary. Her story became less about the night it ended and more about the years that had led up to it. The slow erosion of trust, the invisible cracks that no one had seen until the light of the flames revealed them. Cassie's house never stood again. The lot where it once rested was sold, leveled, and left to grass and silence. Children sometimes rode their bikes past it, their parents glancing away as if the ground itself carried bad luck. But those who had known her, the neighbors, the teachers, the parish friends, couldn't bring themselves to forget. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, a few of them gathered there at dusk. They brought candles, not to mourn, but to remind themselves that goodness can still exist beside horror. They spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb something sleeping. Evelyn Harper always began with the same words. "Cassie gave her life trying to save one. That has to count for something." Inside the prison walls, Leo Phillips became a myth of his own. He aged, but not in the usual way. The boyishness faded, replaced by a sharp, angular stillness. Inmates said he was polite, distant, that he never raised his voice or broke the rules. He worked in the library, reading everything from psychology texts to philosophy. Once, a guard found a note tucked inside one of his books, a single line written in precise handwriting. "Fire cleans, but it doesn't erase." No one ever confirmed if Leo had written it, but the words felt like him. Detached, deliberate, self-aware in a way that bordered on haunting. Prison psychologists continued to evaluate him every few years, more out of academic curiosity than hope for change. Their reports were eerily consistent: no remorse, no aggression, no evolution. "He understands empathy conceptually," one wrote, "but not experientially. It's as if he's memorized the definition of sorrow without ever feeling its weight." Still, Leo remained a model inmate, an enigma who seemed immune to both punishment and rehabilitation. Outside, the world changed. New crimes replaced his in the news cycle. New tragedies captured the public's outrage. But every few years, a true crime documentary would revive the story. The grainy footage, the trial transcripts, the interviews with those who had been there. Each retelling promised new insight, but the question remained the same. Why? Why had a boy destroy the only person who had loved him unconditionally? Some said it was psychology, others called it evil. But maybe, as Detective Marcus Wilson once admitted, the answer was simpler and far more unsettling. Because he could. Wilson himself had retired by then, his hair graying, his voice slower. Yet the case clung to him like a shadow. Reporters occasionally sought him out for anniversary pieces, and though he declined most, he once agreed to a quiet interview for a local podcast. Sitting in a small recording booth, he spoke softly into the microphone. "People always ask if I hate him," he said. "I don't. You can't hate emptiness. You can only try to fill it, and when you can't, you just let it be." When the interviewer asked what he remembered most about Cassie, he smiled sadly. "Her handwriting," he said. Even when she wrote about fear, it was neat, careful, like she believed order could hold chaos in place. He paused, voice low. "I think about that a lot." Cassie's legacy had taken on a quieter, more enduring form. The scholarship in her name grew over the years, funded by local donors and educators who wanted to keep her compassion alive. The students it supported often came from broken homes, kids who carried their own small versions of the darkness she'd tried to fight. One of them, a young man named Daniel Ortiz, later became a counselor for at-risk youth. In an interview years later, he said, "Every time I sit with a kid who's angry, who thinks no one cares, I remember that story. Not the crime, the woman, the one who kept trying." For those who had been closest to the case, time didn't heal. It transformed. Evelyn still visited the site every October. Sometimes she left a single candle. Sometimes she just sat in her car, staring at the grass where Cassie's porch had once stood. She said it reminded her that evil isn't loud. It's quiet. It grows slowly, and it often wears a familiar face. "Cassie thought love could fix anything," she told a local journalist once. "And I still believe she was right. It just didn't have enough time." Back in the prison, Leo turned 30, then 40. His hair thinned, his voice deepened. Guards said he seemed unchanged, like a man living in suspended animation. He rarely spoke of the outside world. When asked if he remembered his grandmother, he answered, "Every day. She was the last person who ever expected anything good from me." It was the closest thing to remorse anyone ever heard from him, whether it was genuine or just another echo of his strange intellect. No one knew. One winter evening, after nearly 3 decades behind bars, Leo was found sitting alone in the prison yard long after curfew, staring at the distant horizon. When a guard approached, he didn't move. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" the guard asked, half joking. Leo looked up, expressionless. "Next?" he said softly. "There's nothing next. The story ended a long time ago." Then he stood and walked back inside without another word. In Miami, Cassie's old church began a new tradition, a candlelight vigil each October, not just for her, but for all victims of domestic violence and family-related crimes. They called it the light that stays. During the first vigil, Marcus Wilson stood in the back pew, unseen, hands clasped. He listened to the hymns, to the murmur of prayers, and for the first time in years he felt something like peace. Not because justice had been done, but because goodness, somehow, had survived the story that tried to destroy it. Later that night, as he walked to his car, he passed the flickering rows of candles, each one reflected in his eyes like tiny stars, fragile and stubborn against the dark. "You did it, Cassie," he whispered under his breath. "You kept the light." Years would turn into decades. The people who remembered the case firsthand grew older, and the story began to drift into history. But it never vanished completely. It lived on in lecture halls, in true crime discussions, in the quiet warning parents gave their children. Pay attention to the ones who seem empty behind the smile. The Phillips case became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the limits of understanding. Because in the end, That's what the story truly was. A mirror. It forced everyone who heard it to look inward, to confront the uncomfortable truth that darkness doesn't always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it grows in the same house, eats at the same table, and sleeps under the same roof. And yet, amid all that darkness, Cassie's faith remained the final note. She had believed that love, even when it fails to save, still matters, because it leaves traces in the world that outlive fear. Those traces became her victory, her echo. So when people pass the empty lot on Banyan Drive today, they don't just see a patch of overgrown grass. They see a story of kindness met with cruelty, of faith tested and transformed, of fire that destroyed but did not conquer. The wind that moves through the palms still carries the faint scent of smoke, but also something else, the quiet persistence of memory, of light. And maybe, in that lingering warmth, Cassie's spirit still whispers the one truth she never stopped believing. Love can't always save a life, but it can survive one's destruction. In the end, every tragedy leaves two kinds of echoes, the kind that burn and the kind that remind us why we still care. Cassie Phillips's story wasn't about how she died. It was about how she lived, about the quiet courage of believing that love could reach even the unreachable. We may never understand what lived inside Leo Phillips, what emptiness drove him to destroy the only person who never gave up on him. But maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe what matters is what we choose to carry forward. The compassion Cassie showed, the warnings we've learned to heed, and the small, flickering lights we refuse to let go out. Because in the ashes of every dark story, there's always a choice: to let the darkness define us, or to light one candle more.